Good morning, everyone. This is very exciting to have the room full and have so many people with us. It is my pleasure this morning to introduce our first speaker, Doug Tallamy, who really doesn't really need an introduction. Once he put out, started writing books and started connecting people, bringing nature home in 2007, he became a household name. Gardeners and native plant enthusiasts. I imagine it was sort of terrifying. There aren't too many entomologists that are household names, but that's a good thing. That's a good thing, and now everybody knows what an entomologist is. But he does have remarkable skill in researching and writing and communicating with people how what we do in our parks and our properties, what choices that we make can make real change in the world. So without further ado, because he told me he wanted a very short introduction so he could talk, here is Doug.
Yeah, that's me. Thank you, Randy. I gave her 15 seconds, a little bit over, but that's okay. First, the good news. The good news, some of you might have noticed that I'm missing a bottom tooth and that I can't hear you. But in March, I'm getting my hearing aids and my new tooth. But for the rest of today, I'm still a deaf pirate, and I'm sorry about that. So. Okay, today's talk is basically, this is what I was asked to do, is talk about the new book, which is called How Can I Help? Saving Nature with Your Yard. And what it is a compilation of questions that people have asked me over the last several years. And I just remind you, we are evolutionary guests on this planet, and our stay here is provisional. That's news to a lot of people, but it's provisional. If we destroy our life support systems, our residency on planet Earth is going to be a short one. I always say that because every person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems, every person bears the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems. Unfortunately, more and more people are recognizing that and accepting that responsibility. But they need more information to actually act on it. And that's really what this book is about. I do get questions on email pretty much every day from people who have already read my other books, have heard the talks, but they still have very good questions. So there it is. How can I help? 499 questions. We'll go over all of them today. Actually, just a few. So it's kind of the next step after you've heard the first several spiels. And one of the common questions I get is, what got me interested in conservation? How did this all start? And it started a while ago, third grade. I grew up in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey, by the way, and it was in a development called Oak Park, and they called it Oak Park because oaks are what they took down to make the development. And our house was on a circle, and our house was the first one built on that circle, and they built them right to left. So the lot to the left of us was undeveloped for a whole year after we moved in. And there was a little pond on that lot. Looked just like that, and I used to go over there every day and see what was happening. It was my first intense interaction with nature. And in spring, this is what was happening. Toads came and sang. Now, I don't remember what I knew back then, but I think it was nothing. So I thought that was cool, and the singers invited bigger toads and gave them a hug. I thought that was cool, too. They kept hugging them. Of course, toads have external fertilization, so they move into the water, and the female lays the eggs, and then the male is fertilizing them as the eggs come out. Then, of course, the pollywogs hatch, and I got to watch the whole metamorphosis here. It was a lot of fun. The pollywogs swam around, and then they developed hind legs, and then they developed front legs along with those hind legs, and then the tail started to shrink, and finally it was pretty much gone. And this is when they're going to hop out onto the land. And I wanted to be there the day there was this mass exodus of thousands of toads, and I was hunkered down next to the pond, but they're little. They're little. That was when the bulldozer came and buried that pond. So that made an impression on me, and the impression was really one that was being made on a lot of people. We've got to save nature before people destroy it. It was the accepted wisdom of the day and remained the accepted wisdom for a long time. But we have to move beyond that type of conservation And we have to embrace restoration. There's very few of us that have the opportunity to save any kind of pristine habitat. But we all can help put that habitat back together again. I could have walked right across to my own backyard and dug another pond. My parents probably would have helped me, but it never occurred to me. That's not what backyards were for. And that's a big lost opportunity there. Okay, question 2. Why can't insects quickly adapt to non-native plants? It's a good question. We all know that insects can adapt very quickly to pesticides, for example. They develop pesticide resistance in just a few generations. And this is how that works. You know, they're not really evolving resistance. They already had it. There's a few individuals in a population that were already resistant to the insecticide. And everybody else gets killed, so it's just the few that are resistant that remain, and they mate and make more. So the next generation, there's more of them, and then more of them. And in just few generations, everybody is resistant. So there's very little adaptation that's going on in insecticide resistance. It's very different when you're talking about host switching, when you're talking about an insect that is adapted to one host plant actually switching to a brand new one. It does happen, but it's very complicated. Let's think about all the steps that are necessary. First, we're going to pretend it's a Lepidoptera. We like Lepidoptera. The first thing you have to do is find a new host. They've got to recognize that plant in a matrix of plants that are out there and accept it as a new host plant. Now, butterflies and moths find their host plants through receptors that are on their antennae. They're smelling them. All plants are putting up a perfume, and it's this mix of perfumes, and they zero in, they find their plant. So there's got to be changes in those receptors. It says this new plant is actually acceptable. Then they land on the plant. All right, we're changing the antennal receptors. They land on the plant then, and they taste it again with receptors in their feet, in their tarsi. The leaves actually smell, and that's a second step in recognizing whether it's a correct host plant or not. So if you're going to recognize a new plant, you've got to have changes in those receptors as well. Then there's a final stage, and that is receptors on the ovipositor. That's the structure that actually lays the egg. It's a final taste. Is this the right host plant? I don't want to put my egg on the wrong host plant. So if you're going to adopt a new host plant, you've got to have changes in those receptors as well. All right, then they lay the egg. Now this is a red-spotted purple egg. It's laid right at the end of a black cherry leaf. If you're looking for those eggs, that's where you look, right on the tip. The larva will hatch. The first thing it does is eat the eggshell, because there's protein in that eggshell and very little protein in plants. But then it has to start eating the plant. So now you need more changes in receptors. There's got to be changes in the sensors on the mouth parts of that larva that says this is the correct host plant. And then you have to have changes in the physiology of that caterpillar that says I can actually eat this plant without dying. I've got to be able to detoxify the compounds that are in this new plant. So there's a lot of things that have to happen to accept a new host plant. You've got to be able to find it among a bunch of other plants and recognize it as a host. You've got to be able to accept it on all levels, the tarsal feet, the ovipositor, the larval acceptance, and in a couple of different ways. So host switching happens, but not very often. As a matter of fact, it's very rare. Let's look at the monarch butterfly. Of course, we brought in black swallowwort as an ornamental plant a long time ago. It's a serious invasive species now. Black swallowwort is in the milkweed lineage, and it smells a lot like milkweed. So it has fooled the monarch. The monarch says, okay, this is a milkweed. They zero in it, they land on it. Hey, it's a milkweed. They lay their egg on it. All those things have already occurred. It has been here since 1854, and after 170 years of opportunity with the monarch laying eggs mistakenly on black swallowwort, the larva still cannot eat black swallowwort. Those changes have not occurred. So even though it's well on its way, it's a very tough adaptation to occur. Okay, next question. You claim it takes thousands of years, if ever, for insects to adopt to new host plants. But some other entomologists disagree and point to several species of butterflies that now breed successfully on non-native plants. How do you explain that? Well, I explain it this way. There's two ways that an insect adopts a new plant. One is the host switching, which I just described, very difficult. The other is host range expansion. Now, in host switching, all those things I just talked about have to happen. Again, very, very difficult. But host range expansion is not difficult at all because it doesn't require any new adaptation. The insects that can use these new plants already have the adaptations necessary to use them, so they can do it right away. So typically, the plant they're starting to use is a close relative of their original host plant, which is why they don't need any new adaptations. Let's use the black swallowtail as an example. It, of course, is a specialist on plants in the carrot family. And it can eat pretty much any of the plants in the carrot family. So when we brought in non-native members of the carrot family, things like Queen Anne's lace and carrots and dill and parsley, the black swallowtails already had all the adaptations necessary to be able to use these plants, and they do. So that's host range expansion. It happens much more frequently than host switching. But even when you look at host switching and host range expansion, if you compare the number of Lepidoptera species that are using native plants versus non-native plants, there's a 90% reduction. So these changes are not happening nearly enough to actually create healthy ecosystems. Why do insects fly towards lights? This is a question that has been asked for, 150 years or something. We've been trying to figure this out, and all kinds of explanations. They're using the moon as a navigation system, electromagnetic fields, very fancy things have been put in the literature over the years. And it's an important question. It's an important question because in the old days, when we looked at a street light, that's what we saw. But when we look at a street light today, we don't see anything. And that is because light pollution kills insects. And those are all the ways that it reduces insect population. It's one of the major causes of insect declines, particularly in the temperate zone where it's been measured. It's a problem because we've got a lot of lights. We're the dark sky people. Hey, you missed a spot. All right, the answer turns out to be easy, really pretty much what they thought in the beginning. Insects orient, it's called the dorsal light response. They orient when they're flying to make sure the light is on top and the dark is below. Light is never coming up from underneath, so that's what keeps them from flying upside down, which means they always have light sources to their back. So if there's an artificial light source, like a lamp, they will fly so that it is always at their back. And if it's always at their back, they've got to go around and around and around. And they keep getting closer and closer till they bang into it and get fried. That is why they go towards light. But we can use that information to reduce the lethality of light pollution, if lethality is a word, I don't know. It's actually very simple to do this. First we have to know why or how, what types of lights are attracting insects. And now nocturnal insects, those are the ones we're concerned with, are orienting towards the moon, the wavelengths put out by the moon, and they're primarily in the UV spectrum. This is why insects like black lights so much. So there's the answer. We just give them lights at the other end of the spectrum. Yellow lights or even red lights would be better, but they sell yellow lights. They call them bug lights. Go to the hardware store and buy them. And the key here is that yellow wavelengths do not attract nocturnal insects. So we have a very, very serious environmental problem, insect decline, which has a very, very simple solution. Just change your white bulbs to yellow bulbs, and you've solved the problem. Okay, I live in an area with lots of Lyme disease. Several websites suggest keeping large lawns because they're not attractive to ticks. These sites also say I should get rid of brush piles because ticks love them. How can I contribute to local ecosystems without getting Lyme disease? Good question. I get it all the time. I also get Lyme disease all the time. I've had it 5 times, So, Lyme disease is serious. I understand that. But let's think about what the deer ticks that are essential part of that Lyme cycle require. Deer ticks do not eat native plants. They do not eat leaf litter. They do not eat brush piles. They eat blood. and they eat blood of mammals. And in a very simple ecosystem, they eat blood of rodents, which is typically the white-footed mouse, and then they mate and eat blood on deer. The reason we have a lot of Lyme disease and ticks today is because we have way too many deer. When I grew up in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey, I found a deer footprint in my front lawn once. And it was so rare, we made a plaster cast of it, and it sat on my dresser the whole time I grew up. Never did see the deer. There weren't any. There was no Lyme disease, and there were no deer ticks. Now, yesterday, I looked out the back, 8 deer standing there, just staring at me. So we got way too many deer, and we have way too many deer ticks, and Lyme disease is going crazy. Now, research is, so everybody say, how do we solve that? You solve that by reducing the deer number, and then that's actually a sociological problem. But you can reduce infectivity rates on your property by increasing the number of alternate hosts. This is research that comes out of the Carey Institute. If you add other mammals to your ecosystem, and you've got to create ecosystems that support those mammals, so things like skunks and chipmunks and raccoons and squirrels and bunnies and those are raccoons, whatever, woodchucks, foxes, all of these things that could be part of our home ecosystems, even in suburbia. Many of them are dead-end hosts. So that, first of all, it diffuses the amount of ticks that are out there. They're feeding on a number of things, not just you and the deer and the white-footed mice. And when it's a dead-end host, it means the Borrelia, the disease organism, doesn't survive in it, and that's the end of that transmission cycle. And this is a great example. In the south, there are lots of deer, and there are lots of deer ticks, but there's very little Lyme disease. Why is that? Because they're also lizards. And lizards are dead-end hosts. There are anoles, and there are a couple species of skinks and other lizards that the deer ticks get on. They feed on them, and the Borrelia dies, and that's what keeps the Lyme disease in check. So making a more complex host system, community in your yard for disease organisms will help reduce infectivity. But let's also think about how deer ticks find you. How do they get you? They don't chase after you. What they do is they climb to the top of a stem of something, and they put out their little legs. It's called questing, and they wait for you to walk by, and then they grab on, and then you've got a deer tick. So if you create a yard like this, where you have a swath of grass, now it's true, deer ticks do not like lawns. They want taller vegetation. They want higher humidity. They dry out very easily. So if you make a swath of grass like that and you stick to it, particularly during May and June, those are the peak periods of disease transmission, you can really reduce the risk of getting Lyme disease. But look what else this yard has accomplished. It has shrunken the lawn, which I talked so much about, which means it's helping the watershed. It's sequestering a whole lot more carbon. Lawn doesn't sequester any carbon. It's helping pollinators. It's supporting a complex food web. It's favoring native plants. And you're doing that all to reduce your threat of getting Lyme disease. So lots of benefit of creating a complex yard like that. Okay, question 6. Plants and animals have always moved around the planet, so the arrival of new species at our shores is a natural process. So what's the big deal? If new species are more fit than the species already here, then they deserve to replace them. I get this question a lot too. There's actually 2 questions there. What's the big deal about new species arriving at our shores, and are new species more fit than the ones that are here? Well, the big deal is the rate at which new species, we'll just call them invasive species, are arriving at our shores. We are bringing thousands of species almost instantaneously in ecological time to our shores, way faster than the communities that are here can adapt to them. Now, in the old days, yes, plants and animals moved around the world, but they did it, at a glacial pace, literally. Just a few species every millions of years or something. So when Central America attached to North America and South America, there was an exchange of species, but even that occurred over millions of years. And the species these new communities, these novel communities, could adapt to each other. They had the time to do that. We're not giving them the time. We're throwing new species at our existing communities so fast, adaptation's not possible. That's what the big deal is. But what about our new species more fit? We used to think they were. I mean, they were out-competing our natives. The multiflora rose, and everybody replaces them very quickly. So they must be super plants. But in fact, no, they are not super plants. They're just plants from someplace else. What gives them a competitive advantage is that they're here without their natural enemies that keep them in check. And the biggest natural enemy that keeps them in check is those deer again. So we've got a lot of deer out there, and guess what they like? They like native plants. They do not like autumn olive. They do not like porcelain berry or burning bush or all the things that are going crazy. They don't touch them. But when the baby oak tree pops up, get it right away. So when we have these big invasive species removal campaigns and then we walk away from them, well, the natives that will come up from the seed bank are nailed right away by the deer, and they don't touch the invasives that come in, and that's what gives our invasive plants such a competitive advantage. They are not super plants. If we reduce the deer population or fence them out, our natives are quite competitive. Went to the Great Smoky Mountain National Park 2 springs ago, right about, well, I don't know, May. And the first thing I noticed was that there's really healthy understory there. I hadn't seen healthy understory in a long time. And I had a ranger with me, and I said, how do you control your deer? And he said, we don't control our deer. I said, well, how come you got understory? He said, well, we've got black bears, we've got coyotes, and we've got bobcats, and we don't shoot them. That's how they control their deer. They don't have wolves, which is the major deer controller, but it's enough to keep the deer population in check. So returning predators, it does work if you can do it in an area where that's possible. When we have too many deer and we don't have deer predators, this is what an understory looks like. That's Japanese stiltgrass. There's no... A typical understory are young overstory trees. It's the young oaks and the young birches and the young hickories. Nothing here because the deer have eaten them all. They've even eaten all of the spice bush, which they don't like. So that, and if you do that for 25, 30, 40 years, you don't have a forest anymore. The old trees fall down and there's no replacement. So controlling our deer population is something that really has to happen. Okay, what about the risks of bringing nature into our everyday spaces? Isn't interacting with nature dangerous? Well, in the old days, lions used to eat us, water buffalo used to trample us, crocodiles, hyenas, there was real danger. But it has been a long time since I have seen a lion or a water buffalo or a crocodile or a hyena in my yard. Our ability to assess risk is really poor. Let's look at what is really killing us out there. Now, the average death from poisonous snakes, from venomous snakes, is about 2 deaths a year. West Nile virus, a typical is about 130 deaths per year. But what's really killing us? Alcohol, 75,000 deaths a year. Melanoma, 8,000 deaths with 76,000 new cases reported every year. Car crashes, a big one, 44,000. Child overheating, 550 deaths from that in cars. Dogs, our best friend, are killing 20 to 30 of us each year. Falling, 20,000 people. Overdose is the big one, 109,000. Texting, 3,228. Autoerotic asphyxiation, whatever that is, 600 deaths a year. Hot dogs, 70 deaths. Lightning, 51 deaths. High school football, 20 deaths. Vending machines. We pull vending machines over on us when we don't get our Coke. 13 deaths. Toasters, 370 deaths a year because we stick our flat screen TVs. They fall off the wall and crush us. Selfies, 379 deaths from selfies. Selfies are 13 times more deadly than venomous snakes. And driving is 1,600 times more deadly than venomous snakes. So We know what the threats are out there. We definitely have to get rid of our phones and no driving home. Can you guess how many people were killed by native plant gardening last year? Okay, now this is an ethical question, and it's a good one. Should we kill invasive species? Do we have the ethical right to decide whether a plant lives or dies? It would be hard to find anybody who did not believe that humans are superior beings and that if there's a conflict between humans and wildlife, humans are going to win. But you know what? Lions think the same thing. Weevils think the same thing. Dung beetles think the same thing, and so does that poisonous snake. Even people who question our inherent right to make management decisions about invasive species are making decisions about what lives and dies every single day. They just don't know that. Every time they plant, let's say, a crepe myrtle, they're planting a plant that's going to produce no caterpillars for that local chickadee, and they're helping to starve that chickadee if it's in a yard without enough caterpillars. They're not thinking about that. When you have a lawn like this, you're deciding whether hundreds of species of native plants can live there and the thousands of animal species that depend on those plants, all through that decision of having a lawn. When we hire a mosquito fogger, we're sentencing not just the mosquitoes temporarily to death, but monarchs, pollinators, the caterpillar food that keeps our birds breeding healthily in our yards. All of those things are sentenced to death. And if we don't control invasives, we're gutting entire food webs. Do we have the ethical right to do that? Why do you only focus on moths? Aren't butterflies important too? No, they're not. It turns out that butterflies are just day-flying, bad-tasting moths. This is the phylogeny of the Lepidoptera, and butterflies, that's the yellow group there, come out right in the middle of it. And they really do. Most of them don't taste very good, which is why they can fly during the day. So they're not, ecologically, they are not contributing to local food webs nearly as much as moths do. Plus, there's a lot more species of moths. For every species of butterfly out there, there's 19 species of moths. Why are moths and the caterpillars they produce important? Because they are the ones that are transferring energy from plants to other animals. They are the meat and potatoes, the bread and butter of terrestrial food webs, according to Dan Jansen. And Dan Jansen has never made a mistake, I think. They're really important out there. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat invertebrates. Most of those invertebrates really are caterpillars. And besides that, moths are really cool. Some of them look like rhinoceroses. Some of them look like fish, and that is not Photoshop. Many of them look like algae. Many of them look like rocket ships or like stealth bombers. Many of them are really good, great crypsis with lichens. There is a moth in there. A lot of them are mimicking bird turds, because who wants to eat a bird turd? This is the camouflage looper. They sew the petals of the flowers that they're eating to their back, so they blend in very, very well. Some of them, the conifer eaters, look a lot like what they're eating. There are 2 caterpillars in there. Others, they're always trying to hide from those predators. So right there, and you can't see my pointer, that's a caterpillar curled up in a helianthus flower bud, eating the seeds in there, blending in really well. Many of them are mimicking dead leaves. This is, in my opinion, the best dead leaf mimic in the world. It's actually from Japan. Others look like seeds. Some of them look like seed pods, a lot like seed pods. Many of them look like sticks, both as caterpillars and as adults. Others look like jet planes or like clowns. Some of them have lightning logos on their sides. Some of them are huge, and some of them are really tiny. Many of them are beautiful, just subtly beautiful or overtly beautiful, both as adults and as caterpillars. And of course, others are not beautiful. Some of them have really effective startle effects. Some of them have 2 heads. Not really. I always have to explain things. I gave this talk once, and somebody came up and said, "They really have 2 heads?" Now, that's a mating pair with the male at one end and the female at the other end. The mimicking snakes is big in caterpillars. That is a sphinx moth caterpillar, believe it or not, a really good snake mimic. Many of them are mimicking things that sting, like yellow jackets. Some of them look like beetles. Some of them look like jewels. Some of them look like that. So I just think they're really cool. Okay, this is a common question with a very unpopular answer. Do honeybees compete with native bees? Well, honeybees are extreme generalists. A single honeybee hive can house 30,000 bees. And it can forage, a honeybee can forage up to 2 miles from their hive. So a single hive could potentially compete with native bees over 8,000 acres of land. Plus, beekeepers supplement their hives with sugar so that their populations are always large, even if there's not enough forage in the landscape to support them. And as of April 2022, there were 2.92 million hives in the U.S., so honeybees have saturated the continental U.S. 11.5 times. Now, if we assume native bee populations are near their carrying capacity, there's as many native bees out there as the landscape can support, the number of flowering plants can support, and then you add 30,000 bees per hive to that same area that's already saturated with native bees. There's no way you can do that without degrading the resources of those native bees. So yes, honeybees do depress native bee populations. Another bee-related question is, privet flowers are good for honey and pollen for honeybees. They're good sources of honey and pollen for honeybees. If we remove privet in our fight against invasive plants, aren't we going to hurt our honeybees? Well, let's think about it. We've got 9 species of privet that are highly invasive in this country. I didn't realize that, but that is me. I'm standing right there. That's one privet bush. Privet in Alabama alone covers 1 million acres, and of course it's in more than Alabama. Now, privet blooms for about a week each year. The rest of the year, it looks like that. It's not providing any resources to anything. But when you cover 1 million acres and you only bloom 1 week a year, what about the other 51 weeks when honeybees and native bees need forage in that particular area? So no, privet is not good for honeybees, except for that 1 week, and they're there the rest of the year. Our oaks are dying right and left, and that is true. As we cut them down, so we've got a number of oak diseases out there. But when we cut them down, should we leave the logs or remove them to prevent infection of other trees? That's a good question. So that actually is that's a red oak on our property that has died from bacterial leaf scorch. It's a serious problem. It's a serious problem right here in New Jersey. But oak disease spores spread when the tree is still alive, when it's producing active disease organisms, and they're spreading typically through insect use. Once the tree dies, that's it. The disease is not spreading anymore. And then you have what we call coarse woody debris. It's downed wood, or if it stands up, then it's a snag, which 85 species of our birds are cavity nesters in snags, so we want to leave snags every chance we get. But downed wood, coarse woody debris, is a really valuable habitat, and we tend to get rid of it all the time. It's valuable habitat for countless organisms, things like collembolans. That's a little spinthurid collembolan. There are millions of them in a log. Centipedes are in there eating those collembolans. Millipedes are eating the fungus. This is where click beetles breed, in those down logs. Fire-colored beetles. This is an interesting situation where you can lift up a bark of a down log and find these larvae all the time, but you never see the adults. Not sure why. Many species of scarab beetles breed in downed logs. So do cerambycid longhorn beetles. And if you ever split wood, you come across the larvae, the flat-headed borers. Leucanid stag beetles depend on logs. Passalid best beetles, buprested metallic wood-boring beetles all depend on those downed logs. And we have several species of butterflies that overwinter in the cracks and crevices of coarse woody debris. Things like mourning cloaks and commas and question marks are all living there during the winter. And of course, we've got our carpenter bees. Why do you think the carpenter bees are in our houses? drilling perfect holes in our railings and our soffits. It's because we removed their resource in our yards. Carpenter ants. Now, carpenter ants do not eat wood, by the way. They simply live in decaying wood that they hollow out. So they're often in our downed wood. And we want carpenter ants because we want pileated woodpeckers. And we want flickers, and we want red-bellied woodpeckers. That's what they rear their young on. If you get rid of your carpenter ants, you've gotten rid of the baby bird food source for many of our woodpeckers. Okay, what's the best way to plant and propagate milkweeds? Of course, everybody wants to help monarchs, which we need to do, by the way. They're now red listed, down more than 96%. Milkweed seeds are the worst way to propagate, at least the hardest way to propagate milkweeds. Many of them are infertile, and if they do germinate, they're tiny little things. You've got to nurse them through. By the way, the deer eat them as well. The easiest way to propagate milkweeds is to take advantage of that big they're stoloniferous plants. They have these lateral roots underground, and what you do is dig up one or two milkweed plants and then chop it into maybe 3-inch sections and replace those sections underneath the soil, maybe about 1 inch, and immediately, that season right away, you'll get a full rammet growing up and a fully functional milkweed plant. Several years ago, we had a vegetable garden, and there were some milkweed plants coming up, and so I rototilled the whole thing to get rid of the milkweed. And then, a couple months later, I had about 500 milkweed plants, so that's a good way to propagate them. Since we're talking about monarchs, is rearing monarchs good or bad? Well, it depends on your intentions. There are 2 reasons that people rear monarchs, or any of the butterflies, for fun and for educational purposes, or for conservation. There are a lot of pluses about the educational value of rearing Lepidoptera. You can learn about various insect life stages, complete metamorphosis, the egg, the larva, the pupa, the adult. Host plant specialization, you never have to mention the word, but kids get it, that you're not going to have monarchs if you don't have milkweeds. And that is true for 90% of the insects that eat plants out there. Very valuable lesson. When we're rearing for conservation, though, you want to rear a lot of them. And I understand the motivation. Research has shown, and this is research right out of my lab, 90% of monarch eggs are eaten by ants before they even hatch. So people say, I want to bring them in, I want to save them. Well, you can do that, but you necessarily have to crowd them. It's a wonderful way to spread disease. It's almost impossible not to spread disease. But another thing that people don't think about is you've removed them from selection pressures outdoors. So all of a sudden, natural selection is not acting on those caterpillars. And if we do that a lot, we're going to be releasing monarchs that have not been filtered through natural selection. The best way to help monarchs is to plant a lot of milkweeds. So natural selection can work. There'll be plenty of milkweeds available for those monarchs. They're never going to run out of food. And the system will work really well. So this is the key to monarch conservation, is get those milkweeds back into our yards. Another question, the monarchs on my milkweed keep disappearing. I get this question all the time. Just when they get big, they disappear. I assume birds are eating them, but I thought monarch caterpillars didn't taste good, so I'm confused. What is eating my monarchs? I get the same question for black swallowtails or for anything that people are actually following in their yards. Well, nothing is eating your monarchs or your black swallowtails. Butterflies will come back. What did I do? I hit something. Butterflies want to get as far away from their host plant before they form their chrysalis as they can, because it is the host plant that natural enemies are tracking to get the butterfly. They're finding a milkweed plant, and then they look for caterpillars or chrysalis nearby. So it's a dangerous place to be. So when it's time to form your chrysalis, they crawl off. This is a monarch in my yard, and look, it's on a grass blade. This is a spicebush swallowtail, or pipevine swallowtail. It's also on a grass blade. We leave doors open a lot in the summertime, and I had some pipevine in the back, about 25 yards away. I once found a pipevine swallowtail chrysalis hanging from our picture frame in the living room because they crawl all across the back door, up through the thing, the kitchen and everything. What they're doing is escaping their natural enemies. So that is the bottom line. Nothing is eating your butterflies. It's just when they are finished growing, they crawl off and are forming their chrysalis someplace where you are not looking. What are those orange and black bugs on my milkweed? Should I kill them? Why is the default always to kill somebody? We are a nasty species, I tell you. There's several black and orange things on your milkweed. One of the most common would be the large milkweed bug, Oncopeltis fasciatus. That's what it looks like. It is a Ligeid, a seed eater, and we don't usually see these till end of July, maybe August, and then their populations start to build. There's two reasons that we see a lot of them, typically on the pods, because that's what they eat. They don't eat milkweed plants, they eat milkweed seeds, but the seeds are covered by a pod, and these guys have sucking mouth parts. Those are nymphs. Those are nymphs. So two hypotheses have been proposed. One is that they're orange and black, which is an aposematic coloration. They're warning the predators, we taste bad, and when you have a big signal like that, the predators get the message even better. I think the real reason, though, is feeding facilitation. They are trying to suck up a solid seed through a straw. It's hard to do. So they don't do that. What they do is digest the seed externally. They spit on it, digestive enzymes, and the seed turns to mush, and then they suck it back up again. And when you have a whole bunch of spitters in the same place, it's much easier to do that. Now, people get upset, they're going to kill all my milkweed seeds. They're not. Milkweed seeds, if you're looking upon, are layered. There's several layers of them. These guys can reach the top layer, and they don't get all of them. So there's still plenty of milkweed seeds left. If you have milkweed and you don't have Oncopeltis fasciatus, there's something wrong, because it's something that ought to be there. Interesting life history feature here is that at the end of September, you don't see them at all. It's because they migrate. They migrate just like the monarch. They fly all the way down to the Gulf Coast, where they continue to eat milkweed pods. They need seeds. So down along the Gulf Coast, milkweeds continue to make pods. Another orange and black creature on your milkweed is the milkweed tussock moth. It's actually a very beautiful moth. They're gregarious, and they feed gregariously because it helps them overcome the sticky latex sap in milkweed. But these guys can strip an entire milkweed rammet, and people get upset, they've killed my plant. No, your plant is going to come up from that stoloniferous rootstock just as if you had mowed it. So no problem there. You do want to have more than one milkweed stalk because they will run out of food. So they're pretty as caterpillars. They're not so pretty as adults. Again, the solution to having the other things, sharing your milkweed with all the fauna that require them, is to have a lot of milkweed. Could you provide your thoughts on the use of southern, more heat-tolerant species within our more northern parts of the U.S.? What we're really talking about here is assisted migration. We've got climate change. As the world warms, should we be planting plants from the south up north? Very common question these days. And I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of assisted migration, and this is why. This is what the jet stream looked like not that long ago. It behaved itself. So it kind of went across the northern U.S., and above it, it was cold, and below it, it was more mild. There were wobbles in it, but they weren't serious wobbles. This is what it looks like today. It's gone crazy, which is why in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, they had 9 inches of snow this year. It got down to 9 degrees. When the jet stream dips way south, cold air comes with it. When it goes way north, warm air goes with it. And what we're really seeing with climate change is increased variability in weather. If we move plants up from the south, they're not going to be able to handle those polar vortices that keep coming. There's also the danger of moving them away from the community that has adapted to using those plants. our native plants co-evolved with the creatures that need them, and if you move them away from those creatures, it's just like introducing a plant from China. Now, it depends on how far you're moving them, but in general, I think it's better that we have plant communities with lots of genetic variation so that they can adapt to the crazy weather swings we're throwing at them. I think that's our best hope. What do you think of no mow May? I think it's a good intention, but a bad idea. It doesn't make any ecological sense. This is what happens when you don't mow your lawn. This was a house down the street from us that went through foreclosure, and nobody mowed the grass. It's a wonderful, if you like lawn, it was a wonderful lawn, and it got tall. But European turf grass doesn't supply hardly anything for pollinators, so you haven't mowed in May, it's now tall, and it's still not supplying anything for pollinators. If you have a terrible lawn and it's full of dead nettle or dandelions, the things that bloom, then you are supplying some resource for generalist pollinators during May. But then in June, you mow it and you pull the rug out from underneath them. Pollinators need forage all season long, not just in May. So what we really need are no-mow places that you never mow. We call them pollinator gardens. And the object is to get a sequence of blooming plants from April all the way through the end of October so that you always have forage for those bees. What do you think of Miyawaki forests? This is a method developed by a Japanese forester named Akira Miyawaki way back in the 70s, but it's really catching on now. And essentially what it is particularly in urban areas, you go and you plant a fairly small area, really, really densely with woody plants. Then what you're doing is getting a lot of plant material into an area very quickly. That is supposed to help manage the watershed. It's supposed to bring in other forms of diversity. It can even build a community because people are helping to plant these things. In the beginning, when I first heard about this, I said, well, I don't know if that makes any sense because in just a few years, those guys are going to outcompete each other and you'll end up with just a few trees. Why don't you just start with a few trees? Well, there are reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. First of all, the advantage is that plant costs are very low because you're really planting with very small plants. And when you plant that densely, weeding is reduced, so you don't have to maintain that area. Maybe the first year, but after that, it's going to keep the weeds out. You're going to have very high plant diversity, which should create high insect diversity, which should be good for everything. Now, that hasn't been tested. I actually have a grad student now who's going to start that work this summer, looking at what Miyawaki forests actually are producing. The disadvantages are that you will lose a lot of those plants through competition over time. But if you started with just a few big trees, first of all, you spent more money on those trees, and then you have to maintain the area around those trees for a long time. So there's a lot of maintenance costs there. So I think we want to take a closer look at Miyawaki forests. I think it's probably a pretty good idea. Question 20, I often find the expense of purchasing native plants is out of my budget. Do you have any suggestions? Rick Dark suggests that we do addition by subtraction. So you don't actually have to buy and plant any native plants. You just have to remove the non-natives that you don't want. This was what our yard looked like at one point. We didn't plant any of the asters. We didn't plant the andropogon. I did plant the oak and the Ilex verticillata, but the milkweed and everything else came in on its own. So there are a lot of things that are bringing seeds into your yard. Your red squirrels and your gray squirrels, your chipmunks, your blue jays are planting oaks and beeches all the time. Ants are moving spring ephemerals. That is a bloodroot seed, and that white thing is an eliasome. Ants love eliasomes. So they carry the seed back to the nest. They eat the eliasome. They can't eat the seed, so they throw the seed in the garbage dump of the ant nest, which is about 1 inch below the surface of the soil, a perfect place for the bloodroot and many other spring ephemerals to germinate. This is how these things move around in your yard. But addition by subtraction, you've got to be vigilant and remove those invasives when they come in, and they will come in. So that's a burning bush. It tells you it's a burning bush because it's red. But you know, they're easy to remove at that stage. You get your little hand whacker and whack, 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 and you're done. So you don't have to spend a lot of money at all. You know, Cindy and I have 10 acres. We've spent about $200, and we did it in one day when a nursery in New Jersey went out of business. We didn't need to buy any of those plants. Now I garden with a chainsaw because so many things are there. Okay, I've been told that all annuals are weeds. They have very little wildlife value and should always be replaced with perennials. Is that true? No, that's not true. The notion that annuals are just placeholders for more valuable perennials, I think, is preposterous. There's a number of annuals that are really important ecologically. How about those jewelweed for the hummingbirds? You know, we put up our hummingbird feeder, but there's a lot of places hummingbirds want to find forage, and jewelweed is an annual that supplies it the second half of the summer. I could go on and on and on. The painted chinnia depends entirely on Indian blanket. The Cuculia asteroides depends on native asters. They really love horseweed. This beautiful goldenrod stowaway actually doesn't do anything with goldenrod. It likes Biden's aristosa, which is an annual. The common spraguea, funny name. It's actually, and also the ragweed flower moth. They're specialists on ragweed. And I know we don't like ragweed, but if we call it ambrosia, its real name, then it's fine. So annuals play a very important role. Do you have a succinct statement to submit to my HOA who recently cited me for growing weeds? I got a lot of statements, so not so succinct, but how about this? We humans face life-threatening crises from climate change and biodiversity loss. Reducing the area of lawn and using more productive native plants in our landscapes addresses both of those crises. This can be done tastefully without using the use of chemicals and without reducing property values. It is the future of landscaping. Okay, back to HOAs. My HOA believes that native plantings reduce property values. This is why HOAs have these rules. They want, you know, you're high status people, you live in this neighborhood, and we want those property values to stay high. How can we convince them otherwise? We have to show them plantings of native plants that are obviously not going to reduce property values. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. You don't get more formal than that, and every plant in that design is a native plant. So, you know, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. What we need to do is provide HOAs with models like this. This is Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. I talk about it all the time. 100% native, except for that little bit of lawn there. No HOA is going to say, Pam, you have to leave. How about this, though? This is a 100% non-native landscape, but it's not being taken care of. So there's Asian azaleas there. There's English ivy on the wall. There's a big Norway maple. There's pachysandra on the ground. It's the maintenance that HOAs really are talking about, not the plant origins. I have a small property. Should I plant several individuals of a few species, or should I try to squeeze as much diversity onto the property as possible, but only have one or two individuals of each species? It's another good question. So it's diversity versus abundance. It depends on what it is you're trying to manage. Let's say you want part of your property to be good for monarchs. If you plant one milkweed rammet, it's not good enough. The monarchs will strip it, the milkweed tussock moss will strip it, and you won't have conserved anything. So what you're targeting becomes important. This is a better way. If you're going to target monarchs, give them what they really need. If you're going to try to help pollinators like masses of particular flowers. They do want diversity, but they want masses of that diversity, so because it minimizes the energy they have to spend to go from flower to flower. So this is a good time to get to know your neighbors. Rather than, most people have properties that are too small to do it all. So get to know your neighbors and divide up the ecological goals that you have. That is a barren neighborhood there, but boy, what an opportunity to meet the needs of all kinds of species if you just divvy it up among your neighbors. Why do you want us to keep leaves on our property? 3 reasons. Leaves are protecting the moisture in the soil, which is essential to soil organisms. They're returning nutrients to the soil. all the leaves all the nutrients your tree used that year are in the leaves that it drops that year. And if you don't get those nutrients back into the soil, over time, you're going to starve your tree. And it also provides a lot of habitat for many creatures. There are more species that live underground than above ground, and they all need high humidity. So the leaves are protecting that. 250,000 mites per square meter of leaf litter, 100,000 springtails, 90,000 proturans, they are primitive insects, 1 million nematodes. These are the creatures breaking down the leaves that are returning the nutrients to the soil. They all need high humidity. Some of the things that are very beautiful and we like need leaf litter as well. The banded hair streak caterpillar develops on oak leaf litter just like that. If you rake it away, you lose that butterfly. There are 70 species of moths that we call litter moths, where the caterpillars develop on dead leaves. Things like the ambiguous litter moth, the American idea, the dark-spotted palthus, and 67 other species. And then all the predators that are eating those caterpillars. A lot of species of carabid ground beetles. How about the lightning bugs? The fireflies, whatever you want to call them, they're actually beetles. They are predators in leaf litter, where they're eating slugs and snails and caterpillars and anything they can catch. When you rake away your leaf litter, you've lost your fireflies. And of course, it's a prime place for many of our birds to forage. What do you do with those leaves? Now this is another house down the street. Most of those plants are not native, but you can put flower beds around your trees. That's where the leaves should go. I did a homestay here. I have no idea where I was or who the people were, but I did notice that they had a little section rocked off there, separated so that they could put their leaves in there. You could do that as well. Why don't we keep our leaves in our flower beds? Well, people worry that our plants won't be able to get up through those leaves. But I ask you, who was raking the leaves before we got here? And there were plants in North America. I read about it. They're much better about getting through these leaves than we think. That's trout lily coming right through leaves. This is wood poppies coming through leaves that I haven't raked at home. And there they are, doing just fine. Delicate little violets coming through the leaves from under my shingle oak tree. There they are early on. And then finally, so the leaves are not preventing them at all. Now, if you pile them 5 feet thick, yes, nothing's going to get through this. So, a normal layer of leaf litter should be okay. Should I mulch my leaves? In other words, run it through the mower? Well, you can, and I guess it makes them more aesthetic, but you've just chopped up the Luna moth. You chopped up those 70 species of litter moths. You've chopped up the dot line white. There's a dot line white cocoon in that leaf litter, and my pointer doesn't work, so I can't show it to you, but it's there. You don't see it. Right in the center of the screen there. And there's no way you're going to see that when you're raking, so you would lose that beautiful moth. This used to be the most common question I got all the time. Do cultivars of native plants have the same ecological value as their parent species? And the answer is, it depends on what the cultivar trait is that's being enhanced. That is Phlox paniculata jenna. It was a natural variant found in the Georgia backwoods. Somebody found it, put a name on it. It has twice the flowers as regular Phlox paniculata, and guess what? It supports twice the pollinators. It's got a name after it's called a cultivar. We did a study with this in a common garden experiment, 3 years. And we looked at 3 traits that are commonly manipulated on woody plants. Enhance fall color, leaf variegation, take a tall plant, make it short, introduce disease resistance, enhance fruiting, taking a green leaf and making it red or purple. Those are the traits we looked at, comparing cultivars with straight species, and the only trait that actually discouraged insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, because you've introduced anthocyanins to those leaves, and those are feeding deterrents. But with flowers, it's pretty easy to discourage, particularly the specialist pollinators. That's bloodroot, but it's the double flower. You've taken the reproductive parts of the plant and turned it into a petal. Very pretty, but it offers the pollinators nothing. Mount Cuba Center is doing a lot of trial gardens with cultivars and their straight species, and they put all the information on their website. I'll show you this at the end of the talk. But if you really want the latest information about how cultivars impact flower resources, go to the Mount Cuba Center and check it out. Does urban restoration work? Or am I encouraging ecological traps that will lure animals to their death? It's a good question. It's a very good question. And you know what? We need a lot more research about this, but the little bit that's been done is very encouraging. Emily Geist, and actually I had a Brian Cutting, a student in my own lab, looking at monarchs in urban situations, people's home gardens, versus out in more natural fields. Survivorship was much higher in the home gardens. Very, very promising. Look what we've done to bluebirds. You know, in the 60s and early 70s, they were in trouble. We had the starling and the house sparrow. We'd taken away our cavity. These are cavity nesters. And bluebird houses were not being used yet. But as soon as we started to use them, the bluebirds loved them, and now they're one of the most common birds in our neighborhoods. So big success there. A guy in Switzerland, Benedict Schmidt, has looked at the impact of adding artificial ponds to a city, Argua, if anybody knows that. But it's an urban area, and he added a bunch of ponds, and then he studied amphibian responses. There's 10 species of amphibians that were declining rapidly in that area. 9 of them increased rapidly when they put those ponds in, even though it's with roads and squishing and all that. The one species that did not increase quickly required larger ponds than what he added. So these are all positive results that suggest we ought to keep doing it. Okay, finally, what gives you hope? How do you not become discouraged by the task at hand? There are some days I do get discouraged, but there are several reasons that I am hopeful overall. First of all, the biodiversity crisis is now part of the global discussion. There's a conference in Paris right now looking at the biodiversity issue on a global basis, and all the countries are represented except us. But it's part of the decision. It's part of the conversation. That is good. The public is starting to recognize that as individuals, we're not powerless when it comes to conservation. And this is what's really encouraging to me, because it's going to be the public that solves these problems. We can shrink our lawns. We can use keystone plants, the plants that are supporting the most caterpillars that run those food webs. We can change our light bulbs, easy as pie. We don't have to hire mosquito foggers that are going to kill everything in our yard. We can put beds under our trees to create those soft landings that Heather Holm talks about. The caterpillars fall down. The soil is not compacted. They can find places to pupate safely. We can add pollinator gardens to our yard. All of this is happening. We're starting to remove our invasive species. We're starting to ban them for sale so that people aren't putting them back. Municipalities they have cost-sharing programs that are helping people convert some or all of their lawn to appropriate native plantings. States are banning the sale of invasives. Delaware has banned the sale of all the invasives, and many other states are doing it piecemeal here and there. HOAs are starting to recognize that native landscaping does not necessarily reduce property value. It's how you do it. Our farmers, we've got a tremendous, almost half the country is in some form of agriculture. Much of it looks like that. Outside the corn and soybeans and wheat, we've got lawn. That used to be the weeds, the milkweed, the New York ironweed, the goldenrod that supported our native pollinators and our monarchs. So we've recognized that's a big mistake, and people are starting to put it back. That's very helpful. University or Iowa State has been working on prairie strips. Wonderful idea. Not only, and you put that right through the corn and the soybeans, not only does it add a lot of resources for our pollinators, but it also intercepts soil before it leaves the farm and the extra nutrients. It's a win-win for everybody. But what has encouraged me the most is the speed with which these changes are actually happening. I didn't think it would happen at all, but it's happening, and it's happening faster than I can keep up with it. Robert Swan recently said, the greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it. It's not going to be someone else. It's going to be you folks. You guys are nature's best hope. Thank you very much.
All right, folks, we're going to stretch his time a little bit. We have about 15 minutes for questions. I know we have several questions that have come in on Zoom. Perhaps we can pick up one of the Zoom questions first. We have some mic runners for questions as was Zoom question.
Can everybody hear me? Great. This is from Bridget Daly. People who want to plant cultivars often point to Mount Cuba studies to justify their use. But their studies, other than yours that they supported, they support pollinator support, only look at visitation and not pollen and nectar quality. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much. It's very difficult to trace the impact of those visits on the health of a bee's reproduction. So that's what they're doing. They are looking at the number of species that come in. But pollinators are pretty good. You're at least it's a measure of the amount of reward that you get. Pollinators can hover in front of a flower. They can measure the electric field in front of that flower, which is a measure of the amount of nectar inside of the flower. And it's also something called headspace, which is the pressure from the vapor, the water vapor produced by the nectar in the flower. So they hover in front of it. If it's gone, if it's not much, they don't bother and they move on. So if they actually land and start to use that flower, it's a measure that there is something there. The quality of that something, no, they're not looking at that. Very tough to do. Yes?
You said that honeybees can outcompete native bees, but do the honeybees actually harm the ecosystem outside of just outcompeting native bees?
Well, we have between 3,600 and 4,000 species of native bees. They did almost all the pollination in North America before the honeybee got here. It would be a shame for them to even if they don't go extinct, there's something called defaunation, where you've reduced their abundance to the point where they're no longer performing their roles in the ecosystem. So will it harm the environment? Yeah, it will. We can't lose our native pollinators. Now, I know honeybees are really important in some forms of agriculture. It's really the hobbyist that's doing it just for fun that might want to rethink that.
You mentioned that overpopulation of deer as being one of the biggest problems. I assume that's true?
Deer?
What is the state doing about it, if anything? Are the states doing anything about it, and what are they doing, and what should they be doing?
I don't think states are doing anything about it. You know, there's a huge pushback from hunters that say we don't have enough deer. So there's a conflict. The deer, of course, are hiding in suburbia where they can't hunt. So hunters typically do not support reducing deer. Bern Blassie at Cornell University says we need to return to market hunting to control deer. Look how well it took care of those pesky bison, and the passenger pigeons are no longer a big problem. The Carolina parakeet. Market hunting works, and he said what we need to do is change the rules and regulate it to the point where we get the deer below the carrying capacity. They're about 14 times over the carrying capacity in most places. That's not good for the deer. It's not good for anything else. And hiring sharpshooters works. You usually cut the population in half once. It's very expensive. You have public pushback against that. But it doesn't solve the problem. Cutting it in half means then you're 7 times over the carrying capacity instead of 14 times over the carrying capacity. So market hunting, I'd love to see it happen, see what, whether it works or not. What should you do? Yeah. Don't oppose deer hunts, for one thing. It's the public that discourages municipalities from doing that. That's about all you could do at this point. Look up Bern Blassie and his papers on it, and maybe he's making suggestions what the public can do.
In my garden, I had a lot of seaside goldenrod. So they bloomed in the fall, and there were thousands of insects, bees, I guess. I don't know if they were honeybees or native bees as well, but it just pointed out that if we plant the right things, they come. Although I kind of want to plant something else so they come at another time, not just in the fall. But it just sort of a comment that way. So.
Well, yes, you want a sequence of blooms so that you have those highly attractive plants, highly beneficial plants all season long. One of the big challenges is midsummer, when very few things are blooming, and early in the spring, when very few things are blooming. So one of our very best pollinator plants early in the spring is our native willows. People don't think of them as pollinator plants, but they bloom really early, and the ground nesting Calides bees and several others depend on them entirely. So you're right, we need those powerhouses all season long. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you so much for a great presentation.
Thanks.
Out of the last 4 years, we've had 2 years of severe drought, summer drought. Last year was the craziest ever. I'm in central New Jersey, and I don't think we've had more than an inch or two of rain between June and November. Like your comments, please, on how you think that maybe the homeowner can plant some plants that are resistant, or your overall view on how to do better in droughts and prepare.
You want me to fix it? Yeah.
I always thought you were a god, yes,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. That's Doug, D-O-U-G. Yeah, you're in a serious drought, and I just saw a thing the other day. It continues. I keep hoping that it's South Jersey that you get 15 inches of rain. You haven't had any hurricanes to boost it. No nor'easters. Yeah. Is it climate change? I think it's something that will disappear over time. How do your plants make it through that? It's not just the plants. The article I read was talking about people. Your water stores are disappearing, so this is a time to not be watering your lawn or washing your car or wasting our precious water resources that we don't have. But pine barrens are adapted to, it's very dry soil. Now the water table's usually pretty close to the surface, and that's how the plants make it. So. No, I actually can't solve this for you, but you're not going to start planting desert-adapted plants because you're really not going to become a desert, I don't think. If we do, then I'll change my tune. But I think you're going to get normal rains again, and I hope it's soon. That's a terrible answer to your question. So.
Hi. Has anyone ever approached you about using one of your books for professional licensure for landscape architects for the passing of the LARE? Because I think we need to make that happen, and I might be the person. Really?
Well, I think some programs are using it as a textbook. So
right.
But that you've got to be enrolled in the program, and otherwise I don't know.
Okay,
Yeah.
that would
if you
be
want to do
very
that, I'll
impactful.
support it.
I will. I'll start that process.
Okay.
Hi there. I'm back in the back here.
I see.
So, as a loving member of this community, I love people who love native plants, and I love native plants. I see a kind of a mental block that we have in the conservation community with how we can relate to native plants. And the particular one that I'm talking about is whether or not we allow ourselves to eat native plants. And I'm just going to give a quick example and then ask your thoughts on it. But this is a bit of a hot button one, but milkweed is a traditionally used edible plant. And people may not know that, but the part one, or among many parts that are edible, is the unopened flower buds. And so, similarly, broccoli, obviously a well-known edible plant, we eat the very same part, the unopened flower buds. And broccoli has a host caterpillar that's associated with it. And you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think it's one of the most common in our region, the cabbage moth. And it's so prevalent, I think, because there's so much cabbage, broccoli, all the species that we cultivate for eating. And so I guess my thought is it's so similar culinarily. I think we're asking the wrong question about whether you eat the plant. The real question is whether you cultivate the plant and whether you have a reason to cultivate the plant. And I think maybe if we appreciated milkweed the same way we appreciate broccoli, who knows, maybe the monarch would be as common as the cabbage moth. And so I would just love to hear your thoughts about that in this community.
You're talking about the cabbage white butterfly, which is actually, it's introduced, it's an invasive species, and one of the reasons it's so common is it has no natural enemies. But yes, we have the mustard family as agricultural crops, and that's what makes a lot of those butterflies. Could we make milkweed an agricultural crop? Sure. What we don't want to do is start harvesting the little bits of natural milkweed plantings without cultivating it for human use. If we're going to use it for human use, let's get it into agriculture and have big fields of it, and no problem with that at all. If that was the question. Okay. We're done?
I think we're about out of time, folks, so that we have enough time for a break before our next speaker. I want to thank everybody. Thank Doug Tallamy again.
Thank you.